Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and this is an intro to Express.js and just in general backend development 2022. So always just like to kind of create like updates. So here's my 2022 video on Express. So bottom line is Express.js is a JavaScript framework focused for building backend applications. So one of the first things we need to discuss is sort of like what is the backend and kind of put that on the perspective, because if you're newer to web development, you probably first have been dealing with front-end web development where you're developing applications in the front end. So let's kind of take a look at how all that works out. Okay, so essentially what happens is that generally you have what's called the client. Okay, and this is also known as the browser. So basically a user who is using Google Chrome or Firefox or whoever. Okay, they're sort of the client. They're the ones who are at the end going to receive a thing. And generally their goal, okay, is to receive, a thing. Okay, so what browser runs. And they can, that browser can run something like HTML, it can run CSS files, it can run JavaScript. Okay, so basically any HTML, CSS that the browser receives, it can then render like the page that I'm seeing right now. So for example, this is a web application, and this visual part, this is Lucidchart that I'm using, and any visual part of this is actually created through HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, but oftentimes, like I actually had to type in like lucid.app to get to the page where this web application lives. Okay, so for example, I might type in, make a request. So let's say a request for lucid.app. So my browser is sending an outgoing request. And that request then has to kind of get routed. So I'm not going to get into like the nuances of all the steps it goes through, like going through DNS and all this stuff. But eventually, it's going to get to another application running somewhere on a separate computer. So there's some computer out there that's running a server. Okay, and a server is just basically a separate computer. It's really a separate application because it could technically be on the same computer, which is what's happening when you develop your Express application. You'll have kind of everything running on your computer. But in practice, when I make a request for lucid.app, that request gets routed to wherever the application, wherever the backend application, the server application for Lucid is running. And then that server application is going to basically handle this whole sort of process. So like that request comes in, which has a bunch of data. And the way I think about this is like a restaurant, okay? Think of the back end, the server, kind of like the back kitchen in a restaurant. I never actually see the kitchen. I don't go to the kitchen to order my food. I order my food through the waiter. That's like the browser. So the browser can take your request. You say, hey, I want to go to lucid.app.com. And then that browser will make sure that request gets to the back kitchen, aka the server. And then and then those chefs in the kitchen, they know how to make that thing that was requested. Okay, I don't need to know in the front how that was created. I just need to know that if I send an order for a pastrami sandwich, I'm going to get back a pastrami sandwich. Okay, so essentially what happens is that the server application is an application that goes through many steps. Okay, so generally what happens, the request comes in, and you may have a step called middleware. Middleware means it's not the end of the story. Okay, so it's like some sort of intermediate step. That's the only real distinction between middleware and what's referred to generally as a route. Okay, and we'll say these are what's called a route. And generally a route is where the response is determined. Like, okay, well, you asked for this thing, here's the thing. Okay, so the request comes into the server. Now, depending on several different possibilities, like this may get routed through this path, which ends at this, generating this response. It may be going to this path, which goes to this middleware, which then goes through this route response. But either way, that response is what the server ends up putting out. Okay, so essentially you always kind of go through this sort of path. Let me not do that there. Maybe do that here. Okay, so that request comes in the server, and again, the server puts it through this kind of chain of events. Okay, so that's why you got to think about your server. Your server receives like an order, like again, an order for a pastrami sandwich, and then has to go through all the steps to make that pastrami sandwich. And then once that pastrami sandwich is ready, then a response is created, which could be like HTML, which could be a CSS file, and what any of the things that the browser needs, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, could be data structure that's JSON, any of these kind of things. Okay, and then that data gets back to the browser. Actually, let me do it this way. Okay, and you see, basically, again, the client says, hey, I want this website. That goes to the server. The server puts it through whatever the path is that it's programmed for that particular server application. And again, that server application can be programmed in any language. Okay, it's not just JavaScript. That's the beauty of Backend. Because at the end of the day, your ability to run code in any language is just dependent on whether the computer that runs the code has software to run that language. That's why you're limited in the front end, because in the front end, you don't know what's on the user's computer. The only thing you can assume is that they have a web browser, and a web browser only can run HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Technically, it can also run WebAssembly, but that's a discussion for another day. While in the back end, you're not running the code in the browser, you're running it on the server application, which can be programmed in any language. Okay, pretty much all languages have built in the ability to receive internet requests. Okay, another way you can think about it is they're called HTTP requests. Okay, so essentially these are all these messages going back and forth are these special types of letters that computers can send to each other called HTTP requests. And generally, most languages generally have a built-in library on how to receive and read those requests. Okay, and the little pipelines that are used to send these letters in the HTTP format are called TCP/IP. So whenever you hear about that's what your IP address is, it's essentially your address in this, transmission control procedure or process system. Okay, every computer has this little, this little sort of network that it is able to communicate over, and every computer knows how that system works, so you don't have to think about it. It just works. Okay, computers that are connected to each other over a network, they're familiar, they're built with TCP built in, so that computer gives itself an IP address on the network, and then basically you can send messages across that network, which could be formatted as HTTP. So any software that knows how to read that HTTP message can then use it. Okay, so browsers know how to decode HTTP messages. Server libraries and frameworks know how to decode and send HTTP messages. So we don't have to think about that. We just have to think about, hey, what do we want this software to do? Because all that HTTP decoding and encoding is kind of done for us by the framework. And that's what Express is going to do for us today. So essentially, it just kind of gives you the outline of web development as a whole. So again, you could be being a front-end developer, which just means you're writing that CSS, HTML, JavaScript that's going to run in the client browser, client side, or you're the person designing this whole process of processing requests, which could involve, getting data from a third-party API, getting data from a database, getting data from all sorts of third-party sources, organizing that, turning that into an HTML file, or turning that into a JSON response, and then sending it out. Okay, so that's the high-level sort of conceptual deal. Okay, and again, that applies to any language, regardless of other than just Node and Express as I'm doing today. It's the same thought process in any kind of backend development. Okay, so now let's kind of start setting up the actual coding code. Okay, so let me open up VS Code and let's open up a folder. So let's go to educational. I think it's one of the teaching. This is one of my videos. So this is the repo where I have all the code from most of my videos, which is linked to in the video description. And I'm gonna have a folder called Express 2022. Okay, and we'll work out of there. Now, one thing you do need to have in order to do this is you need to have Node installed. My advice is to generally have the long-term support version installed. I think I will be working with 19 today. Um, Generally, you should be, for at least for our Express purposes, you should be fine either way. So it doesn't matter if you're using long-term support or 19. You should be able to do what we're doing. But there's been some major changes from like 17 going forward uh, that can affect, especially particularly like working with React or things like that. But that's more front end troubles. Okay, so here we go. So here I am. I'm in my Visual Studio Code editor, and what I want to do is start a new project. Okay, so in Node, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my terminal. It should open up to this Express 2002 folder. Okay, in order to create a new Node project, and what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to create this in a subfolder. So we'll say cd make directory project one. And again, these I'm on a Linux machine, so these commands are based on Bash. So if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine, these commands should be work perfectly for you. If you're on Windows, you might want to download software called git bash, and then you should be able to follow along exactly the way I'm doing it. Okay, cool. So that created a folder, so we see the folder there. Now what I want to do is change directories into that folder, because again, this is my terminal. So essentially, I'm communicating with my computer via text, and basically the terminal is always kind of inside of a folder. So right now it's inside this Express 22 folder, but I want to go inside the project 1 folder. So I'll say like cd change directories project 1. So that way my terminal is now inside that folder. Okay, yay. Okay, so that means any commands I run are in the context of that folder. Now in Node, what we want to do is generally start a new Node project. So again, Node is essentially a software for running JavaScript outside of the browser. Because generally, again, server programs run outside of the browser. Okay, so in that case, we need to be able to run the code outside of the browser. So to create a new Node program, once you have Node installed, what you're going to do is you type in, well, it's been a while. Let's see here. It would be, I think, npm init -y. Okay, and again, what this means is if I do npm init, which would work, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions to kind of start my project. If you want to skip the big Q&A and not have to like think about like, oh, what should I answer here? You can hit -y. -y is a flag. Again, whenever you have a command. So essentially the way terminal works is like this is like the command. This is an argument to the command. So I'm saying, hey, I want to run npm, and npm has a init sort of sub program that I want to run, and then you can pass flags to it. And generally, they always start with like a dash. So -y means yes. Okay, not every terminal program or command line program supports a -y flag, but a lot of them do. It's just there's a lot of reasons why a lot of times you just need to kind of automate saying yes to things. So the -y flag generally is used for that. So this way it just automatically accepts all the defaults to all those questions. So npm init -y. So basically, again, it took all the defaults, and then what it does, if I open up this project 1 folder, it creates this file called package.json. So in a Node project, package.json is sort of the heart. It basically dictates everything, all the information about your project. Okay, so yeah, basically what's part of my project is in here. So here I can see my project name, and these things I can manually change. There's no real need to right now, but I can change things. Okay, but right now all we really need to do is install Express. Okay, so we want to install the actual like Express library, so that way we can actually start working with Express. Again, there's nothing you can do in Express that you can't do without it. The problem is just a lot more work. So again, Express is not a language. Node is not a language. The language is JavaScript. But Node is an environment for writing JavaScript that runs outside of the browser. And Node libraries are libraries that help you write code for that environment much easier. And Express is one of many backend frameworks in Node. Okay, there's also Koa, there's Fastify. Those are sort of like your base level frameworks, and then you have some like higher level bells and whistles type frameworks like Sails, FullTS, Nest.js, etc., etc. There's a whole world. Okay, you could literally spend an entire career just focusing on all that and learning all that in and out. Okay, but what I want to do is to install any libraries, you type in npm install, and you got to be in the same folder as your package.json. Npm install, and I'm going to say all I really want to install right now is Express. Okay, and we're wondering, how do I know it's called Express? Well, if you're ever wondering what Node libraries are available, you would go to npmjs.com. This website here is a big place where you can kind of see all the different things that exist inside the Node world. Okay, so I can type in like backend framework. Okay, and Express should come up pretty quickly. The top towards no. Well, there's a lot of different frameworks, as you can see here. But if I type in Express, it should be one of the first thing that comes up. And see that it's called Express. And literally whatever this name is, that's what I would type in after install. Okay. So there's all sorts of different libraries for like everything you can think of to make your life easier. Okay. So I type in npm install Express. And not only does this install it, so as you see, like it creates this folder called node modules. That folder is where all the libraries get installed. So every time I install a library, they're going to make a copy of it inside this node modules folder. And my project knows that I installed it because in my package.json, it creates this new section called dependencies. So these are the different libraries that my package depends on, that my project depends on. So if you're wondering, hey, did I successfully install it? It should show up here in dependencies. If you don't see it under dependencies, then what I usually double check is make sure that you're in the right folder, because the mistake a lot of people make is they'll do the npm install express, but they're like a folder above or something. So in that case, they're installing in a different folder where there's no package.json, so you're not seeing that whole deal. Okay, and you can always check what folder you're in by doing pwd, that's print working directory. Okay, and now I can see, hey, look, I'm in the project one folder. Okay, that's a good way to double check that, hey, am I in the right folder? Wonderful. Okay, so I have Express installed, so now I can start writing in Express code. Okay, so what we're gonna do is you can create a file. It doesn't matter what the file name is. Like you can literally create whatever file you want. Okay, we'll just call it server.js because it's a pretty explanatory name. Now take a look here. I made a mistake. So look at how these files line up. Okay, so see like how these icons don't line up with the JS icon. So you see I created the server.js file, but I did not create it in the project one folder. I accidentally created it in the parent folder Express 2022. So what I need to do is move that over here. So always pay attention. Like use your UI to kind of help hint at you at potential problems. Make sure things line up the way you expect them to line up, so that way you don't end up getting stuck with weird issues and you're thinking, oh, why is nothing working? It's just because all your files and stuff aren't lining up the way they should. Okay, cool. So generally what's going to happen is that first thing we want to do is we want to import Express. Okay, again, anything you install as a library doesn't magically just become available to you. You have to import it. Okay, and there's going to be two ways, and we'll show you both ways. And the default way, the way that's just built into Node from the beginning of Node history, is the what's called a Node module. And the way this works is you'd create a variable. So I'm assuming you know JavaScript if you're watching this video. If you don't know JavaScript, go watch my JavaScript videos first. So I create a variable called Express. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this function called require. So require allows me to bring in something that was exported from somewhere else. Okay, so you don't see the code because you didn't write the code for Express, but this Express code that was installed in our Node modules folder exported itself. It said, okay, hey, here's the Express library, export it. Okay, there's two ways I can use this require function. Like let's say I had my own thing that I wanted to import, I would just put the file path. So I would be like /file.js. So like I would just, and notice this tells me that, hey, it's a file in the same folder. Okay, that's what the / means. Dot always means the folder that you're currently in, and then you say / whatever the file is. Okay, and that would look for a file that I created. But if I take away if I don't put the / and I just put in a name, it's going to look inside the node modules folder for a folder by that name. So really what I want to type in is Express, because that is the thing that I'm trying to import. So I'm going to say, hey, require Express, the library that I installed. Okay, and then, there you go, const express require Express. Okay, so now I have Express available. Okay, and you can console log it. We can see that this is the Express library. So if I were to run this code, again, I can run this code by typing in node and then the file name. So the file, and again, has to be in the same folder as that I'm in. So right now I'm inside project 1 folder. Server.js is inside the project 1 folder. I can see that visually here. So then when I type in server.js, okay, and yeah, see, it just, when I console log the string of express. I want to console log the variable. There we go. And you see I get this big giant object, because that's what the library is this big object with a bunch of functions I can use. Okay, I don't need to know what all this means. You can read the Express documentation. We're going to go over the functions that we need for this video. Okay, but essentially, like, hey, look, I successfully brought in that library. Now I could type in node file name all the time, but sometimes I might want to create like a little script, because eventually sometimes your commands get a little bit more complicated. So what you can do is you can go into package.json and you can create scripts. You can give it any name you want. So we'll give a script called start. So we'll say start is the name of the script. And then here you type in what command is run. It doesn't have to be a node command. Literally, it could be any command. I can type in like just normal terminal commands. So you see, I put pwd. Now watch what happens when I do npm start. Well, actually, to be more proper, I'm going to do npm run start, just because no matter, I don't want to complicate things too much. So to keep it simple, whatever the script name is, you type that name after run. So npm run start, and watch what happens. And see, it ran pwd. So it printed out my working directory. So it has nothing to do with node. I could literally have this run send any command to the terminal that I want. Okay, so this is pretty useful to kind of create little like pseudonyms for really long commands. Okay, so if I have some really big long command that I really hate typing over and over again, I can create a script to make it easy to do over and over again. But typically the start command is always going to be sort of the command that kind of kickstarts your project. So we're going to say like node server.js. Okay, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now if I type in node run start, okay, I get module not found, poor K. Oh, because I typed in node run. It should be npm run start, my bad. Okay, and you see I get my code runs, logging the express object. Okay, so we got that out of the way. So what happens is that generally what's going to happen is that you now have the library in there, but again, the way Express works is you have to create this application object. The application object is essentially this object that represents sort of like that tree of steps. So remember we middleware and routes, and basically what would happen is that the request would come in and would go step by step. Well, that's what the application object determines. We have to create that object. So, we get to create the application object. Okay, so we can say const app equals express. So this express function creates an application object. Okay, simple as that. So now we have this object, and now what we can do is we can begin registering the different steps. So and then essentially it'll run those steps in the order that we register them with the application. Okay, so let's say I want to register a middleware step. Okay, an in-between step. What I would do is I would use a function called use, app.use, and then what you do is you pass it a function, okay? And then it'll run that function, and since it's the first thing that I'm registering with the app, it's going to always be the first thing that happens when a request comes in, okay? And the way these functions are written is that it takes 3 arguments. It's going to take the request object, so that represents the data coming in. So again, we got a letter from someone's browser, so someone sent our server a request. Okay, and then we're going to send out a response. So this second argument represents this object that we'll be able to use, has a bunch of functions built into it for us to send a response. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to console.log the URL that the page came from. So request dot, and then I can see here all the different things that are inside the request object. So I'm going to say URL. That'll be like, hey, what website, what URL that was requested. Okay, and then what you want to do, and actually there's a third argument we need to specify next. Because the idea is that there's going to be multiple steps. So you need to designate when this particular step is done. So what happens is that whenever I'm done in this middleware, I just say next, and that'll pass it to the next thing that I register. Okay, the next thing in line. Okay, so that's how middleware works. So the big difference between middleware and routes is that middleware you always end with next, because you have to say, hey, go to the next thing. Okay, here we'll have a route. Okay, and we're going to register a route. And a route means like an end step, meaning this is where it generates the response. And we'll say like app.get. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways of sending a message in HTTP. There's like get, post, put. Okay, so if I only want to say, hey, this is how you respond specifically to a get request or specifically to a post request, then I would do that. I could do that through the app.get to specify, hey, this is a route specifically for get. If I don't care, like, so let's just do a catch-all. Let's say, hey, app.all, that's going to respond to anything, whether it's get, post, put, doesn't matter. Okay. So then what I can do is, again, this gets a function, just like the previous one, and it's generally going to be exactly the same as before. So it receives the request object, it receives the response object, except this time we're not going to bother with the next, because this is the last step. This is where it ends. Okay. And then what I'm going to do here is we want to send a response. Okay. So we'll say response.send, or was it response dot been a while. I think it's .send. Okay, and then with send, you can send essentially all different types of data. We'll keep it simple. We're just going to say, hello world. Okay, and see if that works. Okay, so I've registered 2 steps. Okay, and again, this can get really complicated. You might be registering thousands of steps that go in this big, wide journey of steps, as you'll see. But then what we have to do is at the end of this script, we have to kind of say, hey, turn on the server. So then we do app.listen. Okay, and app.listen, what it does, it takes 2 arguments. One, your computer, again, each computer has a bunch of little ports that it can listen for requests on. So it's kind of like you have a block on a street, and just because I say, hey, send a letter to Adams Street, I have to say which house on the block that I want to send a letter to. Okay, so I have to give like a number, like, hey, 140 Adams Street. So same thing here. You want to say, hey, this particular application is going to be listening from what address? Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, it's listening from 3000. Okay, port 3000. And then you can give a function that runs once this function, all it does is just runs when the server starts. So usually you use this for like just a quick console.log saying server is listening on port 3000. This is just so that way you know that the process has started. So now watch what happens. If I type in npm run start, see, it tells me server is listening on port 3000. So now I know that my program is listening on port 3000. So let's see if I go to the client, so now I'm in the client, if I send a request to port 3000, does my program respond? Okay, so I type in localhost. Localhost stands for your computer. Okay, so if you have something running on your computer, that's the address for it, localhost. Okay, localhost that's why, you can't share an address with somebody else for localhost, because localhost always points to the computer that you're on. It's technically a pseudonym for this IP address, 127.0.0.0.1. That, again, is your computer. Now, basically after that, you can put a colon after that, and then you can put in the port number. So I'm saying, hey, my application's on my computer, 127.0.0.1, and it's listening on port 3000. So if I hit enter here, okay, it says cannot get. Okay, so that means I did something wrong. Okay, so whenever you see cannot get, it just means that, hey, my application did here, like my application got the message. There was no response, so I made a mistake somewhere with this app.all. So maybe it's not .all. Let me just see here. .use. I thought that was a .all, yeah. Special case all method applying the given route path middleware callback to every HTTP method. Yeah, so that's correct. So why did it not work? Okay, response, never used. And like I did see, like this console log did happen. The middleware did run, because see, it console logged the request URL. So you notice how it only has a slash. Because essentially the URL is anything after the port number. So essentially it's just saying this, like, oh, okay, you asked for this page. Okay, now if I typed in like orange, /orange, take a look at the console log. /orange. Okay, that's referred to as the endpoint. Okay, so, yeah, I'll just make this an app.get for the sake of simplicity. Okay, and there we go. So now if I shut this server off and turn it back on, because just because I changed it, every time I change it, I got to rerun it. The reason being is that when the program first runs, it loads all those steps at the beginning. It's not continuously reading the file. Okay, so just because I changed the file doesn't mean it changes the program that's running, so I got to rerun it. So that way it runs the new code. Okay, and then if I run this now, okay, so still says cannot get. Interesting. Where did I app.get? Oh, I think it's because there's a first argument. My bad. Now I remember. App.all. There's a first argument. You have to say, hey, what are you listening for? Okay, so I'm going to put an asterisk. Asterisk means like any URL. So it doesn't matter what the origin is. Okay, so let me forget. You have to actually, like, when you're using app.all, app.get, you have to express, hey, like, what are you listening for? So now if I do this again, see hello world. Because I said listen for, the asterisk means anything. It doesn't matter what the URL is. Okay, if I want to be, so basically right now, if I do this, like, let's actually res.send request.url. Okay, so we're going to send back the URL. Okay, and let me actually, again, I have to restart the server. Okay, I see I'm asking for slash. Now if I ask for /orange, I'm asking for /orange. If I say /orange/cheese, then I'm asking for /orange/cheese. And that's generally what you're putting in that first argument. In this argument, I could be like, I want this to be a response to slash, or I want it to be a response to /orange. And then that's how these functions work. Basically, the URL has to match this, whatever is here, for this function to run. So that's how you start creating all these branching paths, because you say, okay, well, if the URL is this, do this. If the URL is that, do that. Okay. Now also let me change this to the method, so that way we can see how we have different methods. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring up this tool called Insomnia. So what Insomnia does, it just allows you to kind of create, it's just another tool for sending HTTP requests. Okay. So I can go in here and type in 127.0.0.1/3000. Okay. Oh, not /3000, :3000. See, I get. See, it was a GET request, but now if I send a POST request, because you can't do that in the browser, a browser will always automatically send a GET request. So you have to use other software to test these other types. Because generally to send other types of requests, you'd have to do that like from JavaScript in the front end. You can't just type it into the browser. So that's where tools like Insomnia become really useful, because they allow you to test those other routes on your server to make sure that they're working. So post, see, depending on what kind of method I'm sending, it just logs me what kind of post. So again, there's two ways for me to narrow whether this particular route runs. I can be like, okay, this route only runs when it's slash and when it's a GET request. So both of these things would have to match. And long as this is true, then this function will run at its step in line. And that's essentially what will happen. And then again, I could send back HTML. So I could actually send back like an HTML string. H1, hello world. Okay, so I will stop the program. And then if I go back to the main route, like if I go here, see, I want to get can I get orange, because now there is no route that handles this mix. I have no route that handles a get request to /orange/cheese. But if I go all the way back to the main, just like slash, see, I get that hello world response, because I do have a route that responds to a /get. Okay. And that's pretty cool. So that's essentially the pattern. I can also send JSON data if I don't want to send like an HTML page. And there's a lot of ways to send HTML pages. Like you can use what's called a templating library to create like full-on robust HTML pages, such as EJS, Pug, Handlebars. There's a bunch of them. I have a lot of other videos on Express where I go through templating engines. This is mainly an introduction. But I could also send like a JavaScript object. So I could be like, message hello. And if I restart the server, okay, I hit refresh. And see, I get a JavaScript object. I get a JSON object instead. And that's kind of like how you would create like an API. Okay, so I might go get some data from a database and then send it back as the response. But yeah, so that's the basic idea of Express. That's all it does. So when you think about a server application that serves a website, this is literally all it's doing. No matter what language, it's going to be generally the same pattern of how it works. So once you understand sort of the premise and like the why, whatever language you're using, it's much easier to understand sort of like how to do the thing, because it's always the same steps. We're receiving a request, and then I got to say, hey, this is what I want to send back as a response, and then that's it. That's backend development in a nutshell. It gets pretty complicated as you try to figure out how to send particular responses, but essentially, you got to think of a backend developer as kind of like that line chef at a restaurant. Their job is to know that, hey, if this order comes in, okay, I need to design the way that we create the thing that was requested. Okay, so have a great day and enjoy. I'll probably put out a few more Express videos later on, but hopefully you guys enjoy this, and this gives you a good idea of how to get started with Express here in 2022. And I will see you all later. Again, make sure to head over to devnursery.com, grokoverflow.com, AlexMercedCoder.dev. Follow me on Twitter at AlexMercedCoder. But otherwise, have a great day. I'll see you all later.